Hello again, and welcome to Aviation News Talk, where we talk general aviation with relevant news and flying tips for pilots and student pilots to help keep you safe. I'm Max Truscott. Today we'll be reviewing the regulations about instrument flying currency, and I'm guessing most of you will be surprised that you might be calculating your currency incorrectly. Plus, we'll talk with AOPA's Tom George about pilot reports or PIREPs, including what you need to know about them, issues with PIREPs, and automated ways to submit them. In episode 181, we talked with Jason Blair about the requirements for the ATP-CTP and about the current state of airline hiring. So if you didn't hear that episode, you may want to check it out. And if you enjoy this show, well, help your friends enjoy it. Take a moment right now, look for the share button on whatever app that you're listening to us on, and go ahead and send it to a friend who you think might benefit from the show. And then follow up with him or her and suggest that they subscribe to the show. Or if they're using the Apple Podcast app, the new word now is follow the show. Thanks so much for your help. This week in the news, there's a new way for you to get daily updates on the price of fuel at airports. Several countries are about to lose LPV minimums on all of their RNAV GPS approaches. And finally, we'll tell you about a Pilatus flight that airlifted Lions. All this and more, and the news starts now. From AINonline.com, Textron stands up an eAviation division. Textron is formalizing its presence in the electric aircraft market with the formation of a new division called eAviation. The company confirmed that Rob Scholl has been named to head the unit. Scholl's new role was described by Textron as leveraging the work across our aerospace and defense businesses to develop new opportunities and take advantage of our fixed-wing and rotorcraft expertise in emerging technologies. He'll be charged with assembling enterprise talent throughout Textron, building external partnerships, and creating a path for further development and utilization of aircraft electrification and connected mobility technologies in the global market. In a call with stock analysts in January, Textron CEO Scott Donnelly said Textron intended to take a cautious approach to the eVTOL market. Quote, "I do think we have to be cautious here in terms of not getting too far out in front of a regulatory environment that's very uncertain to allow that business model to be successful," he said. But Textron's Bell has already been working on both manned and unmanned electric vehicles for some time with both its Nexus Air Taxi and Autonomous Pod Transport, or APT, designs. Evidence that Textron intended to commingle expertise on these aircraft and other vertical lift programs emerged last year when Bell established an office on Textron Aviation's Wichita campus. And also regarding Textron, this comes from AOPA.org, Textron kicks off Special Olympics Airlift. Textron has put out a call for all Cessna Citation, Beechcraft King Air, and Premier Beachjet and Hawker owners and operators to help transport more than 4,000 athletes and coaches to the 2022 Special Olympics USA game. The event takes place in Orlando, Florida. This will be the 8th time that Textron has conducted a Special Olympics airlift. Since the first one in 1987, nearly 10,000 athletes and coaches from across the U.S. have been flown to Special Olympics. This time, Textron hopes to recruit 228 aircraft owners by February 28, 2022, to help transport a portion of the 4,000 athletes and coaches invited for the event. In addition to the pilots and aircraft volunteering, fuel and in-kind support are also being requested. Textron says that operators in every state are needed to donate the use of their aircraft. The Special Olympics, World Games, and U.S. Games will begin on June 5th, 2022, with the athletes arriving the day before. Participants will be returned to their home base on June 12th, 2022. Ron Draper, Textron Aviation President and CEO, said, "This signature event is a unique opportunity that enables everyone, from our employees to our customers, to ignite our shared passion for lifting others up and supporting our communities by giving the athletes the joy of a once-in-a-lifetime aviation experience." Traveling to Orlando for the games may be the first time some of the athletes ever leave their hometown, let alone fly in an airplane, said Tony Wiley, Regional President, Special Olympics of North America. The travel experience provided by Textron Aviation and its customers will be the ultimate bookends for one unforgettable week. And we'll provide a link in the show notes where you can reach the Textron Airlift page if you'd like to participate. From AOPA.org, iFlightPlanner to update fuel prices daily in AOPA products. Get more accurate fuel information on 100 low-lead, Jet A, MoGas, and UL94 in the AOPA Airports and Destinations directory in iFlightPlanner for AOPA, with daily updates that will now be provided by iFlightPlanner. The switch from data provider 100ll.com to iFlightPlanner allows AOPA to display availability and fuel prices for MoGas and UL94, the unleaded fuel alternative produced by Swift Fuels. Information about 100 low-lead, Jet A, and Jet A with PRIST will continue to be available. Prices will be updated daily rather than weekly, providing pilots with more up-to-date information for planning fuel stops. AOPA and iFlightPlanner will be working to add real-time, on-demand pricing information in the future. Eric Rush, AOPA Director of Product Development, said, "We know prices play a role in where pilots decide to stop for fuel. With iFlightPlanner, we can provide the most up-to-date information possible for a wider variety of fuels." In April 2020, AOPA switched its legacy flight planning tool to iFlightPlanner for AOPA, a mobile-friendly online planning tool that depicts TFRs, displays fuel prices, allows route rubber banding and airway waypoints, and enables flight service briefings. The Flight Planner is free to AOPA members. Members also have the option of upgrading to iFlightPlanner Core or Premium to send flight plans from the tool to electronic flight bags, including ForeFlight, Garmin Pilot, FlyQ, FlightPlan Go, Jeppesen Flight Deck Pro, and Jeppesen Mobile Flight Deck and WingX. From FlyingMag.com, FAA updates bank of sample knowledge test questions. As part of the overhaul that the FAA's pilot certificate testing system went through beginning in 2011, the agency has produced a regular update of several components of the system and communicated those changes through its main training and testing page on the FAA website. A recent update that became active on March 29 includes editorial updates to the bank of sample questions that the FAA releases for each of the primary certifications and rating levels, including private, instrument, commercial, flight instructor, and ATP for airplanes, rotorcraft, and gliders. Those changes will be followed by a more in-depth update planned for June 28th later this year. Pilots and instructors can also anticipate an update to the Airplane Flying Handbook in June 2021 and to the Pilot's Handbook of Aeronautical Knowledge in September 2022. An addendum to the PHAK, which is what we tend to call the Pilot's Handbook of Aeronautical Knowledge, was released on February 10, 2021, explicitly stating that because marijuana remains an illegal drug at the federal level, its use is prohibited by pilots and other FAA certificate holders. You can access a summary of the recently released updates, along with the planned changes schedule on the site as well. You'll want to bookmark the FAA's training and testing page if you are working toward a new certificate or rating, or if you are an instructor needing to keep up with changes for your students. And we'll include a link to that page in our show notes. And of course, you can always get to the show notes by going to aviationnewstalk.com/182 for episode 182. From AOPA.org, AOPA seeks to have glider pilots Squawk 1202 for all VFR ops. AOPA submitted a proposal to the FAA on March 24th requesting the beacon code 1202 become the standard for pilots flying gliders, VFR, to use regardless of whether they are in contact with ATC. Currently, the 1202 code is assigned to VFR glider operations that are not in contact with ATC to differentiate them from VFR traffic squawking 1200 because of the different nature of the operations. While powered VFR aircraft typically fly in straight, predictable paths, gliders often make abrupt changes in direction or altitude, AOPA explained. This makes it very important for ATC to be able to differentiate gliders from other aircraft. The FAA published an order in 2015 for VFR aircraft to squawk 1200 regardless of whether they were talking to ATC. Previously, it was just for aircraft not in contact with ATC. And AOPA said the same should be extended to VFR glider flights using the 1202 code. This change would help ATC better identify gliders flying near busy airspace and landing at towered airports, increasing safety in the airspace system. It would also allow glider pilots to operate using one code rather than having to change codes in flight, which can be difficult to do on a compact transponder and in a cramped cockpit. And in international news from flyer.co.uk, that's Flyer magazine, SHAPS confirms no LPV approaches after June. Now, this refers to the UK. It says GPS approaches using LPV, or Localizer Performance with Vertical Guidance, will stop on June 25th this year, the government has confirmed. The Secretary of State for Transport, the Honorable Grant Shapps, has confirmed that the government could not agree on terms with the EU for continuing to use EGNOS, which is essentially Europe's version of WAAS that we use here for satellite augmentation. Mr. Schaap said, I recognize that it nevertheless remains a disappointing outcome. The UK's participation in EGNOS will cease on June 25th following our departure from the EU and the end of the transition period. And of course, I believe this is all a result of Brexit. The European Geostationary Navigation Overlay Service, or EGNOS, is Europe's regional satellite-based augmentation system, or SBAS, that is used to improve the performance of global navigation satellite systems, or GNSSs, such as GPS and Galileo. It has been deployed to provide safety-of-life navigation services to aviation, maritime, and land-based users over most of Europe. The government recognizes that after this date, airspace users will not be able to benefit from localizer performance with vertical guidance procedures, and instead, where possible, rely on lateral navigation procedures, said Mr. Schaap. The UK government did seek to retain the use of EGNOS, and throughout the negotiation period, we continued to discuss the matter with our European counterparts. However, after carefully considering the terms that were offered to us, including the new levels of associated cost, it was not possible to reach a satisfactory settlement with the EU in the 24 December 2020 agreement. Quote, although the Department for Transport did not lead on these discussions, and the decision was agreed as being the government's official position on the matter, I recognize that it nevertheless remains a disappointing outcome. My officials subsequently reviewed the issue with their colleagues from across government to consider the possibility of continuing these discussions. Unfortunately, it was accepted that for the immediate future at least, there is little prospect of renewing negotiations with the European Commission on the matter. Mr. Schaap also confirmed that the government has begun work on exploring alternative options for providing a commensurate navigation system. This includes discussions with the UK Space Agency for a dedicated UK replacement service. But it is unfortunately going to take some time and considerable investment to implement, said Mr. Schaap. The government recognizes that the immediate loss of EGNOS is clearly an important issue for airspace users, myself included, and we will be focusing our efforts on resolving this issue to ensure safety for all. Well, and the upshot of all of this is that if LPV minimums will not be available, the minimums on GPS approaches in the UK will probably be several hundred feet higher at a bare minimum, which means that when you have lousy weather, occasionally a few more aircraft will not be able to complete their instrument approaches and will have to go elsewhere. From AIN Online, MySky launches aircraft ownership cost prediction tool. And in some ways, this relates to a story we had a few weeks ago about new jet owners who purchased during the pandemic who were surprised by the high cost of operating a personal jet. The story says, spend management platform MySky rolled out its new MySky budget tool to help aircraft owners and operators to more accurately assess annual costs. Harnessing the data about multiple operating costs it has collected since launching its main spend management tool, the company is using AI, or artificial intelligence, and modeling techniques to generate accurate projections that enable clients to generate meaningful budgets and give a higher degree of control over expenses. MySky offers two versions of the budget tool. The light option is specific to a particular aircraft model, while a more sophisticated Pro option is calibrated to be specific to an individual aircraft tail number. The tool makes its calculations on historical cost data and also by assessing average cost based on trends it has seen with individual suppliers and system providers such as FBOs, catering companies, hotels, and car rental providers. MySky claims that the new system draws on more than 30 million operationally sensitive and financially validated data points from across the business aviation supply chain that it has gathered since the main platform was launched in 2015. Its platform is now supporting more than 400 business aircraft worldwide. MySky co-founder Chris Marich said, "We have learned how to predict the behavior of suppliers without contacting them, and so we can mimic what on average they will charge in the future without asking, and we can produce budget data from this based on an operator's geographical preferences for flight." He says, "For too long there's been a knowledge gap for private jet owners about the real cost of aircraft ownership that goes beyond asset acquisition. Budget replaces outdated and legacy databases to provide owners with accurate financial insight, as well as allowing them to analyze costs between any aircraft type, whether new or pre-owned. Furthermore, it supports operators and aircraft management companies with reconcile running costs to owners." And finally, from airlive.net, 3 Lions were ferried to Malbula Game Reserve on board a Pilatus PC-12. And the photos from this are absolutely great. The story says, Kalahari Lions are renowned for being the largest of Africa's lions. The Kalahari lion is a subspecies that behaves and looks different from other lions due to its adaptation to the Kalahari environment. These 3 lions weighed in at approximately 200 kilograms each, which would be, around 440 pounds. They were ferried to increase genetic diversity and reduce population subdivision across lion populations. Pilot Menno Parsons flew the 3 lions from, and I'm going to butcher these names, of course, from the Kahamab Kalahari Reserve to the Malabula Game Reserve, and Dr. Andy Fraser was responsible for the darting and monitoring of the lions. The Kalahari lions tend to live in smaller, more scattered groups, unlike other lions found in other areas. Due to their adaptation to the Kalahari environment, they have larger paws and leaner limbs and can cover greater distances. And again, this is just a really great photo. And I tried to reach out both to the pilot, Menno Parsons, and to the doctor on board, Dr. Andy Fraser. Neither of them got back to me. And so I'm hoping that the flight turned out okay and that the lions didn't end up having them for lunch. Well, that's the news for this week. Coming up next, my weekly updates. And then we'll talk with Tom George of AOPA about PIREPs, all right here on the Aviation News Talk podcast. And now let's start with a fun flying destination.
Hello, Max. My name is Michael. 2 things I wanted to comment on. You asked about where we like to fly to. One of my favorites is Block Island. I fly out of Danbury, Connecticut. Block Island, KBID, is about a 45-minute flight. It's kind of a pain in the neck to get there by surface transportation, being an island. And it's a wonderful little place to fly to for 4 hours or 6 hours. The airport is about a 25-minute walk from the ferry landing, which is where there are a lot of restaurants and hotels and good people watching. It's about 10 minutes or less on a little folding bicycle that I throw in the plane. So I go down there and have a little vacation in 6 hours and then go back home. And it's a marvelous little escape. I wanted to comment on another thing. You talked about sometimes going someplace else and instead of getting checked out in a rental plane, just taking an instructor with you. I've done that in foreign countries where unless I found an NREG plane, I couldn't possibly get checked out. And I found it's terrific. The instructor, of course, knows where the good scenic spots are. They know the language if that's an issue, if ATC is not in English locally. It's better all around. I just get in the plane. I say, look, you do the radios and tell me where to fly. I'll do the flying, and we have a good time for an hour or 2. And I've done that several times, and it's been very rewarding.
Michael, thank you so much for your fun flying destination. And if you are listening right now and like to share one with everyone else, it's very easy to do. 2 ways to do it. You can just look for the Voice Memos app on your smartphone, and after you record about 90 seconds, just email it to me at aviationnewstalk@gmail.com, or you can just go out on the web if you've got a microphone on your computer to aviationnewstalk.com, click on Listener Question at the top, and you can then record either a listener question or your fun flying destination. Either way, it's pretty easy. I look forward to hearing from you. And I wanted to let you know what's up with me and my teaching. A lot of people know that I stopped teaching back in late November because the levels of COVID spiked really high in this area. I resumed teaching about a week ago. It's been quite a shock because I have had my schedule go completely full for the next 2 weeks, literally 100%. In the past, I would typically teach 1 or 2 flights a day. It's been more like 2 or 3 every day. So it's been a little bit crazy. I feel like I've gone from 0 to 60 overnight. But, it's really fun to be back in the cockpit. Surprisingly, it doesn't feel like I missed a beat. Still doing a lot of the same things that did in the past. And it certainly is fun to be back up there in the sky flying with friends and new clients alike. So anyway, just want to let you know that I am back teaching, and I will continue to work to put out new episodes as frequently as I can. Now, here's an article that I ran across. It's actually from a year ago, but I don't recall having seen it before. It's from IFR magazine, which I subscribe to, and I think it's a great magazine. It says, ILS on the chopping block. It says, first deployed in 1938, the ILS has become the global gold standard of instrument approaches. There are 1,550 Cat 1 ILS approaches in the U.S. and 1,700 localizer-only procedures. The number of ILS approaches remains steady since WAS was introduced with LPV approaches in 2003, and then they show a graph in the article, and they say the graph below shows a flat line for ILS approaches, whereas LPVs have risen dramatically. Today, the 4,476 LPVs outnumber ILS approaches by nearly 3 to 1. And then it says about ILSs, more than 70% of the ILS equipment is beyond its 20-year service life. In 2015, the FAA began looking to rationalize ILS approaches. In this context, rationalize means cut. And by the way, I have read elsewhere that maintaining ILSs is very expensive. I looked once at the FAA's maintenance budget for a year, and I believe the cost of maintaining each ILS was about $120,000 a year when you factor in all the different things that have to be done to flight check the ILS and to adjust it and so on. Anyway, they say that in the following year, the FAA developed a cost-benefit quantitative model and conducted an analysis at about 2,900 airports with few or no RNAV SIDS or stars. The finished product was a plan to decommission Cat 1 ILS approaches at some of these airports between 2020 and 2030. Before a decision was reached, the project was shelved in 2017. Before rationalization halted in 2017, the FAA analyzed 402 ILS and localizer approaches at GA airports. The estimate for removal ranged from 167 to 292. Total savings would be somewhere between $246 million and $430 million, respectively, over 20 years. And they finish up by saying the operational and financial benefits of LPV are compelling, and when they say that, I think what they mean is RNAV approaches, because LPV is not a type of approach, it's a type of minimums on an RNAV approach. And they say the FAA will likely cut 200-plus ILS approaches over the next 5 years. After more than 80 years of robust service, it's the beginning of the end for ILS. And here's an interesting little story I read on Twitter a few weeks ago. It's from Josh Kowit, and he gave me permission to read this to you. He says, last Friday, after 2.5 hours of IFR practice approaches, I came in to land on runway 6 at KPNE. Now that's the Northeast Philadelphia Airport. Just after rolling out on touchdown, the plane started veering to the right. I asked my instructor, Tom, if his feet were on the rudder pedals. He said no, so I immediately hit the brakes before we went off the runway. We shut down the engine on the runway. We jumped out of the plane to inspect things. It was 25 degrees out, 10 p.m. at night. Right tire under the wing was blown. As I looked up at the approach end of the runway, I could see a landing light headed our way. The control tower was closed, so I ran to the plane and grabbed my handheld radio to call up the plane on final. The landing plane, a Citation 10, couldn't hear me. They were on a 8-mile final, and I had a tiny radio. I ran into the plane to turn the airplane radios back on, which had more power and more range, but those took time to boot up. Finally, the airplane heard me on the handheld. They decided to circle in the pattern. I also asked them to call Philadelphia Approach and tell them not to send anyone else in. We then taxied the plane off the runway onto a taxiway where we were just clear of the runway. The jet then asked if I could inspect the runway because we blew a tire and any debris could be dangerous if they headed at 120 knots. Then our incredible mechanic Jim came out and changed the tire right on the taxiway. So many lessons learned, and he says those would be get the plane off the runway first, especially at night, and then assess the issue. Bring warm clothes, be prepared to be outside. A handheld radio is a must, so many reasons to have one. Know your mechanic and appreciate them. So my congratulations to Josh on handling this incident extremely well. If you fly long enough, you probably eventually will have a flat tire on the runway or have an engine quit and be stuck on the runway. This has happened to me multiple times, and it's important to notify approach to not send in any more planes. If you're going to be stuck on the runway for more than a couple minutes, then you should also contact either airport management and have them get a NOTAM issued that the runway or airport is closed. Or if you can't reach airport management, then you should call the same flight service station number that you use to get a weather briefing, 1-800-WX-BRIEF, and tell them the runway is closed and that they need to issue a NOTAM. And good point about having handheld radio. Those are extremely helpful in a variety of different situations, so you should consider getting one and carrying it with you when you fly. So great job, Josh, and thanks for letting us share your story. Now let's review another FAR regulation, this time 61.57C, the regulation regarding instrument currency requirements. And while we're reviewing the regulation, think about this. If today were March 30th, what's the earliest date on which you could have done 6 instrument approaches and still be legal to fly IFR? And here's the regulation, 61.57C, instrument experience. Except as provided in paragraph E of this section, a person may act as pilot in command under IFR or weather conditions less than the minimums prescribed for VFR only if 1. Use of an airplane, powered lift, helicopter, or airship for maintaining instrument experience. Within the 6 calendar months preceding the month of the flight, that person performed and logged at least the following tasks and iterations in an airplane, powered lift, helicopter, or airship as appropriate for the instrument rating privileges to be maintained in actual weather conditions or under simulated conditions using a view limiting device that involves having performed the following. 1. 6 instrument approaches. 2. Holding procedures and tasks. 3. Intercepting and tracking courses through the use of navigational electronic systems. Now, item 2, this would be for use of a full flight simulator instead of an aircraft. Use of a full flight simulator, flight training device, or other aviation training device for maintaining instrument experience. A pilot may accomplish the requirements in paragraph C1 of this section in a full flight simulator, flight training device, or aviation training device, provided the device represents the category of aircraft for the instrument rating privileges to be maintained, and the pilot performs the tasks and iterations in simulated instrument conditions. A person may complete the instrument experience in any combination of an aircraft, full flight simulator, flight training device, or aviation training device. 3. Maintaining instrument recent experience in a glider. And by the way, I'd never heard of flying instruments in a glider before, so I looked it up. Section 61.3E3 requires a person acting as PIC of a glider to hold a pilot certificate with a glider category rating and an airplane instrument rating. And so for maintaining instrument recent experience in a glider, number 1, within the 6 calendar months preceding the month of the flight, the person must have performed and logged at least the following instrument currency task iterations and flight time, and the instrument currency must have been performed in actual weather conditions or under simulated weather conditions. A 1 hour of instrument flight time in a glider or in a single-engine airplane using a view-limiting device while performing interception and tracking courses through the use of navigation electronic systems. B. 2 hours of instrument flight time in a glider or a single-engine airplane with the use of a view-limiting device while performing straight glides, turns to specific headings, steep turns, flight at various airspeeds, navigation, and slow flight installs. Item 2, before a pilot is allowed to carry a passenger in a glider under IFR or in weather conditions less than the minimums prescribed for VFR, that pilot must A. have logged and performed 2 hours of instrument flight time in a glider within the 6 calendar months preceding the month of flight, B. use a view-limiting device while practicing performance maneuvers, performance airspeeds, navigation, slow flight installs. Now let's go back to my original question, which was if you were to fly IFR on March 30th, what's the earliest date on which you could have done 6 instrument approaches and still be legal to fly on that day? Now, years ago, I thought the answer would be September 30th, since that would be exactly 6 months before March 30th, but that's incorrect. 61.57c refers to calendar months. So if you count 6 months back from March 30th, you might have come up with October 1st, counting the 6 months as October, November, December, January, February, March, which would be 6 calendar months. But that's also incorrect. If you read 61.57c carefully, you'll see that it says within the 6 calendar months preceding the month of the flight. You have to have completed 6 approaches. So when you're calculating instrument currency, you don't count the current month, which seems a little odd to me. You just count the 6 months preceding or coming before the current month. So if we don't count March, we start counting backwards starting with February. So the preceding 6 months are February, January, December, November, October, and September. Therefore, if you flew 6 approaches on September 1st, you'd still be current almost a full 7 months later on March 30th. But of course, that raises an important question, and that is the difference between currency and proficiency and between being legal and being safe. Remember, all FAA regulations represent the absolute minimum standards, and you won't always be safe just because you meet the legal minimum standards. And by the way, when you passed your private pilot check ride, did you go out and brag to your friends that you had just met the minimum standards for becoming a private pilot? Well, probably no one in the history of aviation has done that. But if they did, it would be consistent with what we say about the private certificate, which is that it is a license to learn. So realistically, it may not be safe for you to fly IFR if all 6 approaches that you've flown to meet the instrument currency requirements were flown 6 months ago. A far better way to maintain currency might be to fly 3 approaches every 3 months, or perhaps fly 2 approaches every 2 months. So remember, just because you meet the instrument currency requirements doesn't mean that you are proficient. And likewise, just because you meet the minimum legal standards doesn't mean that you will be safe. So when you fly, don't just meet the minimum requirements for currency. Instead, try to consistently exceed the minimum requirements for all kinds of currency requirements, not just instrument currency. And make sure that you are not only current, but also proficient in all of your flying. And here are a couple of important points about instrument currency. You don't have to be in an airplane to log the 6 approaches required for currency. You can do all 6 of those approaches in an ATD, or Aviation Training Device, which is the class of device found at many flight schools. When you use a device of any kind, request and keep a copy of its FAA Letter of Authorization, or LOA. Unless the LOA states that you can log experience in the device as PIC or SIC and count the takeoff and landings, you cannot enter these in your logbook. When logging an approach for instrument recency experience under FAR 61.57, you must record the airport name, approach name, and type, and if it was done in an ATD, you should note the device model number and the simulated weather at minimums. Also, after you have your IFR rating and your logging approaches in an ATD for instrument currency purposes, you are then permitted to fly those approaches without a CFII being present. So now there's little excuse to not go down to your local flight school and practice IFR approaches often. Note that I said if you fly approaches in a simulator, the weather needs to be set for the MDA or DA of the approach, that is the minimum descent altitude or the decision altitude. But if you're flying IFR in an airplane by yourself without a CFII in the airplane, how low do the clouds have to be on an approach to count toward IFR recency requirements? Obviously, if you have a CFII in the plane, you could fly to minimums using a hood or other view-limiting device, and you could log the approach that way even if there weren't a cloud anywhere in the sky. But you can't fly with a hood unless you have a CFII or safety pilot. And if you're flying by yourself, you might rarely be able to log an instrument approach for currency purposes if approaches in the airplane had to be flown to minimums, because of course the clouds are rarely right at minimums for an approach. Fortunately, the FAA addressed this in a 2015 Info, or Information for Operators statement. An article at aopa.org gives a nice summary. It says, "What constitutes a loggable instrument approach?" is the question that FAA addressed in a recent Info statement. The statement was issued after recent requests for clarification and legal interpretations concerning the 6 instrument approach procedures that an instrument-rated pilot must log every 6 months in order to maintain his or her IFR currency as required by FAR 61.57C, which of course we just talked about. Generally stated, 61.57C provides that a person may act as PIC under IFR or weather conditions less than the minimums prescribed for VFR, only if within the 6 calendar months preceding the month of the flight, that person performed and logged at least 6 instrument approaches, holding procedures, and intercepting and tracking of courses. Meeting the requirement of the FAR through the use of an aircraft as opposed to a simulator or other training requires that the flight be performed in actual weather conditions or under simulated conditions using a view-limiting device. According to the FAA, a pilot may log an instrument approach for currency or training when the pilot accomplishes the approach in accordance with several conditions. The pilot must operate the aircraft solely by reference to instruments in actual or simulated instrument IMC conditions. To log the approach, the pilot must be established on each required segment of the IAP to the minimum descent altitude or decision height. Typically, to log the approach, pilots must execute the entire approach, beginning with the initial approach procedure or associated feeder route, and fly the initial segment, the intermediate segment, and the final approach segment of the IAP. However, the pilot may receive actual or simulated radar vectors to the final approach or be otherwise directed through an appropriate ATC clearance to a specific approach and still log the approach. The missed approach segment does not have to be flown for the approach to be logged. although the FAA encourages doing so for proficiency purposes. Now, here's the key point here. The FAA does not require the ceiling to be at MDA or DA during a flight in IMC. The approach may still be logged if an aircraft maneuvering in IMC transitions from IMC to VMC on the final approach segment of the IAP prior to or upon reaching the MDA or DA. If the operations are conducted in simulated IMC, the simulated IMC must continue to the MDA or DA. The FAA noted that if a flight in simulated IMC deviates from the final approach segment for safety reasons such as traffic avoidance, the pilot may still log the instrument approach as long as the aircraft has passed the FAF or final approach fix. The FAA further noted that simulated instrument conditions require that the other control seat be occupied by a safety pilot with a current medical certificate who is appropriately rated in the aircraft, and the pilot operating under the simulated instrument conditions must also log the name of the safety pilot. So the key thing when flying in actual for currency purposes, you can't break out of the clouds until after you have passed the final approach fix. And here's a message from John Chargo, who recently made a donation via PayPal. He said, "Hey Max, I passed my commercial check ride earlier this week. I heard after my check ride that my DPE, that would be his examiner, was very critical of lazy 8s and had failed a handful of people I know over them. Luckily enough, just prior to the check ride, I re-listened to your episode 149 with Jason Blair and realized I was driving my way through lazy 8s and not letting the plane gracefully perform them. I spent some time dialing them in prior to the check ride. I think you and Jason likely saved me from failing. I'm making a PayPal donation similar to what ground instruction would have cost me. I know that listening to the podcast isn't loggable ground instruction, but it is valuable. Keep up the great work, John." John, thanks so much. Great message, and congratulations on passing your check ride. And this comes from Victor C., who's one of our Patreon supporters. He says, "Max, thank you so much for the message." I had just replied to him. This is exactly what sets you apart from all other podcasts. Your professionalism and attention to detail. I always thoroughly enjoy your show and look forward to the next release. As a student pilot, you help me be a better pilot through the wonderful content and interviews you feature. Keep up the great work, and thanks again for your contributions to this wonderful community. And part of my response to Victor said, "It's letters like yours that puts gas in my tank and keeps me motivated to crank out new shows most weeks. I'll probably read part or all of your message on an upcoming show. Cheers, Max." Interestingly, probably more than half of the email that I get every week comes from people who support the show via either Patreon or PayPal. And part of the reason that I mention it on most shows is that every month we lose about half a dozen people because their credit cards have expired. And sure enough, this month we've lost 5 people. And so we're constantly looking for new supporters to backfill for those that we lose. Well, it's been 3 weeks since I've read anything about new supporters, so let me tell you briefly about recent new Patreon supporters. We have a new mega supporter who has signed up at the $200 a month level, and that's Matt Souza. He's a computer engineer who used to work for Embraer in Brazil before moving to Chicago a few years ago. He's now a student pilot flying a Cessna 152 at the Chicago Executive Airport, and he's getting very close to his check ride. And at the $200 a month level, in addition to getting all the other goodies at lower levels, such as some of my free books, he also gets to chat with me by phone a couple of times a month, and we've already spent about an hour on the phone. Great time talking with Matt. And we had several other new supporters in the past 3 weeks. They include Samuel Kramer, who signed up at the $20 a month level, and Steve Hope, who's a relatively new supporter who just increased his donation to $20 a month. We also have Adam Salyer at $20 a month. So all 3 of those, in addition to getting the various goodies I offer, will be getting access to the bonus videos that I post several times a month. And also thanks to Ray Bell, who joined on as a new patron supporter. We also have some one-time donations. These came through PayPal. Thanks to Shane McFarland for his $50 donation and to Matthew Lauren for his $10 donation. And if you'd like to support the show, think about what you might pay for perhaps an hour of ground instruction and consider making a donation to the show. You can do it on a monthly basis by going out to aviationnewstalk.com/awesome, which will take you to our Patreon site where you can enter your name and credit card and select how much you'd like to donate each month, and that will be billed automatically. You can also make a one-time donation or a monthly donation through PayPal at aviationnewstalk.com/PayPal, and you don't even need a PayPal account to sign up to do that. And typically on the first show of the month, I would read the list of all of our mega supporters, but I'm going to hold off until next week to do that because this show is running a little bit long. Coming up next, we're going to be talking about PIREPs and what you need to know about them. Plus, we'll talk with AOPA's Tom George around some of the issues surrounding PIREPs, all right here on the Aviation News Talk podcast. Now let's talk a little bit about PIREPs and also about AirReps. An aircraft report is a report of actual weather conditions encountered by an aircraft while in flight, and there are two types of reports, PIREPs and AirReps. A PIREP is reported by a pilot to indicate encounters of hazardous weather, such as icing or turbulence, and its location is based on the distance and direction to a nav aid, such as a VOR. An AirRep is a routine, often automated report of in-flight weather conditions such as wind and temperature. For example, for a number of years, the UPS fleet of aircraft has been equipped to automatically generate AirReps in flight, and that's part of the reason that the winds aloft information in the Sirius XM weather service you may use has become so much more accurate in recent years. AirRep locations are specified by longitude and latitude, which is better for international routes. The PIREP format is more common over the contiguous U.S. Outside the U.S., you'll find a lot more AirRep reports. PIREPs provide valuable information regarding the conditions as they actually exist in the air, and a lot of that information can't be gathered from any other source, so PIREPs are important. Pilots, for example, can confirm the heights of bases and tops of clouds, location of wind shear and turbulence, and of course, location of in-flight icing. If the ceiling is below 5,000 feet or visibility is at or below 5 miles, ATC facilities are required to solicit PIREPs from pilots in the area, though I got to tell you, in my experience, that rarely happens. When unexpected weather conditions are encountered, pilots are encouraged to make a report to a flight service station or ATC. When a pilot weather report is filed, the ATC facility or FSS adds it to the distribution system so that they can brief other pilots and provide in-flight advisories. Now, PIREPs are pretty easy to file. Typically, a pilot would submit a new PIREP over the radio by talking to a flight service station. So if, for example, you're talking to ATC and getting flight following, you should always first request permission to leave the frequency. Now, in most cases, ATC will give you permission to do that immediately, but sometimes if they're about to hand you off to another frequency, for example, they may tell you to wait and make that request to change frequencies and give a PIREP until after you're connected with the next controller. Now, you probably know or should know that the Universal Flight Service Station frequency is 122.2. So if you don't know the frequency for flight service in your area, always try 122.2 first. And if you don't reach anyone there, well, then look on a VFR sectional chart and find the VOR that's closest to your location. And as I'm always teaching student pilots, the information inside the VOR information box is about the VOR. But the information outside the VOR information box, just above and below that box, is information on how to contact flight service in your area. Now, if you see the letter R next to a flight service station frequency, you might think, hey, that's the frequency that you're going to receive on, and you'd be wrong. It's actually the frequency that you transmit on and that flight service will receive you on. You, by contrast, will be listening or receiving to flight service by turning up the volume of your nav radio so you can hear flight service talking back to you through the VOR. And if there's no R next to the frequency shown, well, then everything is a lot simpler as you just transmit and receive on the same frequency. You can also give your PIREP to ATC, but if you do that, frankly, your PIREP is a little less likely to make it into the distribution system where other pilots will be able to see it than if you were to give your PIREP directly over the radio to flight service, which is the preferred way to go. Also, there are now a couple of automated ways you can generate a PIREP, and I've tried several of these recently, and I'll tell you about the results of those trials after our conversation with Tom George. There is a standard reporting form that outlines the information you should include in a PIREP. The first 5 items are required information whenever you make a report, and then you need to include at least one other piece of weather information. The first 5 required items in all reports are the 3-letter station identifier for the nearest airport that reports weather information, whether the PIREP is routine or urgent, your location, which could include the distance and radial on which you're located from a VOR, or, for example, you're giving a PIREP for a route rather than just a point in space, then you can enter 2 identifiers, for example, 2 airports, if you want to describe the route that you're reporting weather for. You also need to give the time in UTC, and you need to give the altitude or flight level using 3 digits for hundreds of feet. So, for example, if you're at 5,000 feet, you'd enter that as 050. And then you can enter one or more items of the following fields: the type of aircraft you're in, the sky cover or cloud layers with bases and tops, weather, which would include visibility, air temperature in Celsius, wind direction and strength, turbulence, icing, and then there's a remarks section. If you're giving a PIREP over the radio, don't worry too much about the format I've just given you, as the flight service specialist will ask you for the required information, and then you can just tell him or her about the weather that you see. If you'd like more detail on the format for submitting a PIREP, you may want to read parts of the FAA's advisory circular AC00-45H called Aviation Weather Services. And of course, I'll include a link to that in the show notes. Now that we've talked about the basics of submitting a PIREP, let's talk with Tom George in more detail about PIREPs, including who uses them. By the way, it's not just pilots. Some of the issues with the current system for PIREPs, and information about training courses on PIREPs. Tom serves as the Alaska Regional Manager for the Aircraft Owners and Pilots Association. He promotes GA on behalf of pilots in Alaska, which is where he lives, by the way, and supports AOPA's efforts regarding weather-related issues, including pilot reports. He uses a Cessna 185 for business travel and data acquisition. And now here's our conversation with Tom George. Well, Tom, great to have you here. Thanks so much for joining us on the show.
My pleasure.
So I'm curious, how did you get involved in PIREPs?
Well, I've followed them for a number of years, but in 2015, I think it was, at the Valdez fly-in, which is, had several hundred airplanes that had flown in VFR to this location in south central Alaska. And it wasn't exactly a bluebird day, and there was not one PIREP filed in the course of that. So I happened to ask the flight service folks that were at the event and that were providing information. And they went home and looked into it and realized, there weren't any. And this kind of started a discussion, which actually led to a working group that Alaska Flight Service still continues to this day on a monthly basis on PIREP improvements. And since then, of course, AOPA got involved at the national level by doing a PIREP survey in 2016, and we've followed up ever since in weather surveys to kind of track progress and issues in the PIREP department.
Now, are PIREPs more important in Alaska than they are in the rest of the country?
I'd say yes, from the standpoint that we are weather poor in terms of our number of ASOSs and AWOSs in the state. And I did a comparison a few years ago to the rest of the country. We'd have to have 2.4 times as many, or about 180 more stations to have the same average density that you enjoy down in the continental United States, as you're sometimes referred to. So yeah, PIREPs are important to us to kind of fill in the gaps and help us collect enough information to make intelligent decisions for either deciding to take off or continuing on a given route.
I was surprised to learn that PIREPs aren't just for single points in space, but they can also be filed for routes. Tell us about that.
Well, yeah, route reports, and again, this is one thing that makes PIREPs different. Not only, a lot of PIREPs just are point observations, but there is a route report. It can include 2 or more locations, again, broken out by identifier or distance direction from a nav aid. But this allows us to actually kind of report conditions like going through a mountain pass or along a stretch of terrain, as opposed to just at that point. And I know I look for those very carefully, because getting through the mountain passes actually between Fairbanks and Anchorage, which is where I fly fairly routinely, is one of the key points I'm liable to get turned around. So a route report through a location like that is a very valuable commodity.
And does that report have multiple locations along the route where it provides data?
Yes, the OV field, the location field, will have 2 or perhaps 3 identifiers, which allow you to tell what it is. Now, in this day and age of automation, the challenge becomes, how do those get plotted? And this has been a topic of discussion for several years, and there have been some adjustments in this, and it may still today come out different depending on whose application you're using to view PIREPs. But typically, what you'll find in a graphic display is the midpoint of those 2 endpoints is where the the dot ought to appear on a map. And then when you hover over it or however you open up the pilot report, you'd see the details.
Interesting. And so might it say, for example, that, visibility is 3 miles at the beginning of the route and 5 miles at the end of the route?
It could, although what I'd encourage people to think about, and I guess I'll use an example myself, is when I'm flying from Anchorage back to Fairbanks, I'll give a route report, say from Talkeetna to Cantwell, which is kind of over lower mountainous terrain, 7,000 foot peaks typically, of those conditions, and then I actually get to the higher terrain and the pass itself. So I would give a second report there to try and keep it to where conditions were somewhat uniform rather than make a very complicated report. So you can start putting a bunch of stuff in the remarks, but I think it's most helpful if you indicate, along this route, 3,000 foot ceilings, visibility 10 plus, negative turbulence or whatever, and then give a different segment if the conditions change significantly beyond that.
Okay. And I think most of us as pilots are used to pilots being the primary audience for PIREPs. But when we talked earlier in the week, you were telling me that there are a lot of different audiences for PIREPs. Tell me about some of the users.
Well, this was a revelation to me, kind of digging into this a bit. And of course, we start out with, as the pilot on the ground who's trying to make an intelligent decision about whether to take off or not, just looking at PIREPs. Another audience is the PIREP, or is the pilot along a route that's looking at conditions ahead to figure out whether I should keep going or return or deviate to an alternate. ATC also uses pilot reports to adjust traffic flows, IFR traffic flows. And it's not only to know whether a thunderstorm or some severe weather moved in, causing them to change a route, but also when it's cleared, that they could restore traffic to whatever their preferred route would be. The weather forecasters are another audience for these. They use them to modify their forecast and to validate their forecast, and they certainly have told me that they have either issued or canceled segments, sometimes based on a single pilot report. And then the final audience is weather researchers, the people that are actually working to bring new algorithms to play to make better forecasts for us. They're using our PIREPs potentially years after the fact to run against models to see how well their model takes out. So yeah, there's a bunch of users for pilot reports. And to me, that breaks, as we're giving pilot reports and thinking about those audiences, I kind of break it into two categories. If you're reporting significant weather, either unforecast or hazardous weather, yeah, get the important details and don't worry about anything else. But if you're just giving across a pilot report in the middle of a cross-country flight or something, try and make it relatively complete. Because again, with the different audiences involved, fragments of pilot reports aren't near as useful as a more complete report.
Okay. Yeah, and I think people probably don't realize that they can give just a couple pieces of information or they can give a lot of information on a PIREP. I filed one yesterday in the air using one of the automated tools that I was checking out. And I just basically gave the temperature and the winds aloft, and that was it. So I would imagine that even something that little on a clear day might be useful to somebody at some point.
Well, the challenge there becomes, we're in this day and age of automation, and I don't pretend to have a full and comprehensive understanding of this at this point, and I'm not sure anybody else does either. But certain reports are going to get filtered based on whether you have information in different fields, like sky cover or icing or turbulence, et cetera. And actually, one thing we've seen in some cases where PIREPs didn't appear to show up is, well, yeah, I gave that information, but it got stuck in the remarks section. But because the field, the primary field, was empty, then that didn't get treated as a report by whatever that system was. So I'd at least try and give information in kind of some of the primary fields like sky cover and visibility and turbulence, or icing if you're in an icing environment. And I'd make sure and include the altitude, because the flight level also, some more and more systems are starting to filter PIREPs based on altitude ranges. So if it goes in as flight level unknown, what's going to happen to that? So yeah, we're in an interesting period of time as we take this somewhat antiquated teletype era system and and it gets morphed into the modern world with different applications and different filtering that happens along the way.
Yeah, it does seem to me like PIREPs are kind of the poor stepchild compared to other tools that pilots rely on a lot. I think Nextrad is probably the thing people really rely on heavily, yet PIREPs fulfill an important role and can give us information that you can't get from Nextrad and other tools. Well, I know that AOPA has been heavily involved in probably the past 20 years in different aspects of PIREPs. Tell us about some of the things AOPA has been doing.
Well, just in my time with AOPA, which has been about that long now, AOPA launched the SkySpotter program back in 2001, and this was a program that they started co-sponsored by the FAA and the Weather Service, which involved a training component that the Air Safety Foundation, or today the Air Safety Institute, put on to help pilots know how to file reports. And if you identified yourself as a SkySpotter pilot report, that actually got tagged into the remarks section, and that was one way that AOPA used to for several years to kind of track the number of PIREPs and the effectiveness of their program. So that's gone on. As I mentioned, in 2016, AOPA actually did a national survey just on PIREPs, which provided a lot of information about the state of the system at that time. Some things like a lot of pilots had kind of lost confidence in the system. That they felt that was either something only the airlines did. Another problem was they felt that if they gave a pilot report to ATC, it didn't necessarily get passed on and entered in the system. So why bother? And if they gave it to flight service, at least down in the CONUS, the main part of the country with Lidos flight service, FAA at that point had a requirement that you had to give all the fields, and the pilot or the briefer had to read back the pilot report details and confirm them. And that was becoming such a hassle. A lot of people said, I don't have time to do that. And actually, after the survey came out and we talked to FAA, they actually relaxed that requirement. So ever since then, in what's now been an annual weather survey since about, I think, 2017, we've asked pilot report questions to continue to kind of follow the progress of the PIREP development world. And we're still pushing for some changes to the PIREP system to hopefully make it more functional.
And what kinds of things you've been doing more recently in terms of training courses and things like that?
Well, AOPA, I guess the other thing we participated back in 2016 was a Ntsb PIREP Summit. They were digging into PIREPs and have since put out some recommendations. And we're kind of pushing today for changes in that system to do things like provide a feedback mechanism, like you were experiencing yesterday, where your PIREP showed up in one National Weather Service web system and not in another. And we need some way when those issues happen or they're reported incorrectly to get that information back in the system so we can figure out why and hopefully make some systemic changes to improve it for the future.
I think that probably the biggest issue that we face is people just aren't filing enough pilot reports. What are your thoughts on, the value of encouraging pilots to file more often?
Well, and I failed to add in response to the question you just asked that AOPA revised its PIREP training course in 2020, I think. So there is now a new PIREP training course on AOPA's Air Safety Institute website, which I would certainly encourage people to check out, that goes over some of those details. It does talk about things like route reports. So I guess in terms of filing pilot reports today, my suggestion would be that this isn't a numbers game alone, just how many pilot reports, but think about when you're flying, especially cross country, when you have time in the middle of that cross country and in places that aren't next to an AWOS or an ASOS, those are good times to file pilot reports to help kind of fill in the network of observations. And again, all those audiences will benefit from that. The other thing I guess I'd suggest is if you are in the vicinity of an automated weather station and you're observing conditions significantly different from the automated system, that would be another time to consider filing a pilot report so that some information that is maybe not available to the sensor on the ground gets into the system that's material to the information that everybody else is looking at in the long run. So pilot training, though, is another area that needs work. From our 2020 survey, we can tell you that private pilots are least likely to provide an unsolicited PIREP. Only 8% people responding to that were private pilot certificate holders said that they either always or frequently supplied unsolicited reports, whereas 26% of people with ATP ratings responded that they always or frequently pilot reports. So helping the private pilots get introduced to this PIREP system, I can tell you from firsthand experience, my son, a couple of years ago now, when he went through private pilot training when he was in school in Arizona, at no time during that training did his instructors demonstrate or help him give a pilot report. They accessed pilot reports and used them, but there was no instruction given or demonstration of actually filing a pilot report. And I think things like that go a long ways to helping us, especially in the GA world, to take advantage of all the flying that we're out there doing, often away from the busier hubs, to fill in our network of weather reporting points.
I know that often when I call for flight service briefing prior to taking off, at the very end of that conversation, they'll say something like, pilot reports are appreciated. So they are soliciting that point in time. And I understand that ATC is actually required to solicit pilot reports under certain kinds of weather conditions. And yet I almost never hear that happen.
Both flight service and ATC have requirements, and I can't rattle them off the top of my head, but under certain ceiling or forecast of thunderstorm or other hazardous conditions, they're actually required to request pilot reports. That's a long-standing issue. And of course, you maybe need to know something about where the pilot is, which ATC would know, but flight service might at least initially not be aware of that. But one of the other things that we've at least talked about is beyond the boilerplate request for pilot report that you get when you get your weather briefing, or sometimes even if you open your flight plan, why not set up a system in this automated world where the weather forecasters actually could put some dots on maps where they want pilot reports, and we could see them on our apps without having that request made from flight service to help fill that gap. So, I mean, there's some things that are at least being talked about in the community. You don't make changes to a big system like this casually, of course, but there might be some other ways in the long run to solicit targeted pilot reports where they're needed the most. And of course, the other thing we learned in AOPA surveys, what the pilots want the most are automated ways to put in pilot reports through their apps. And you mentioned, using one of those yesterday, and hopefully there'll be more apps come along, and I know there's some in development now that actually make that easier, and the communication link is still probably the biggest challenge at the moment, and certainly in Alaska, where if you're relying on cellular communication, an awful lot of the state has none. So I think we're going to have to wait till we get satellite internet comes down as more affordable before we see that. But the next generation of ADS-B will have pilot report capabilities built into it, and I'm not aware of any manufacturer that's come out with any product doing that yet, but the standards have been modified to make that possible, and in the long run that may be a big help to us.
So what you're saying is that at some point in the future, pilots with ADS-B will actually be able to create a pilot report and transmit it from the air through ADS-B?
That is my understanding. Again, I haven't looked into those details, but yes, that is the intended purpose, is that ADS-B could be the communication link that gets the PIREP to the ground and into the system.
Boy, that would be really great, because ADS-B coverage, at least here in the lower 48 in the CONUS, I believe that above 5,000 feet, their goal was to have virtually 100% coverage here in this particular area. Yesterday, when I was flying, I filed a report at 1,500 feet and another one at 5,000 feet, both over the Central Valley, which is pretty close to sea level. And in both cases, I was able to get LTE cellular data on my iPad, and so I was able to do that. But of course, that's pretty rare. Usually only when you're close to the ground can you get to LTE. So I think you point out correctly that being able to automatically transmit and receive a pilot report, that communication link is probably the weak link in what we have right now.
Yes, I think it is. And of course, some of the apps, you can do other things like buffer it and then transmit it later when you get into good coverage or even on the ground. Of course, that delays it getting into the system. And we've had some discussions about that. I mean, at one point, and this is many years ago now, Flight Service didn't keep in their own system, at least here in Alaska, pilot reports more than about 2 hours. So if you wanted a pilot report that was 3 hours old, you weren't necessarily going to get it. I'm very pleased to see that a number of the apps that are available today let you select how far back in time you would like to look, and some of them at least at 12 hours, which is helpful not only for establishing trends, but for this notion of if you filed some pilot reports while you were out flying, and then when you came back later on the ground, you could pull those up and see how they came across, and again, look for errors or other details like that. So there's a lot of progress being made. The FAA is looking at PIREPs at the national level and putting a fair amount of energy into, getting better controllers or better tools rather for the ATC controllers to be able to put in the reports that they take directly rather than having you leave the frequency, go to Flight Service and file, and then come back to an ATC frequency. So I think in the years ahead, we will see more improvements in the PIREP system.
Yes, I think there are a heck of a lot of opportunities in the future for improving the system. Tell us, where do you think we go from here?
Well, I think there are a number of things that are happening. And as we've discussed a little bit already, the need to improve the emphasis in initial and recurrent pilot training is something on us in the community, instructors and flight schools to work on. Again, AOPA is pushing for a feedback loop to improve the automated tools that Flight Service either has now or is developing to kind of smoke out some of the errors. We're certainly expecting to be able to leverage existing cockpit technology to make, with apps that make it a bit easier to file pilot reports. There is even, I believe, a proposal on the table to put inclusion of PIREP submission into the private or instrument pilot certificate standards. So it's something that would be more firmly embedded in pilot training. And I guess the biggest thing is to educate pilots on this bigger picture of who all uses pilot reports and the importance of putting them in, just so that we're willing to take the time and do it when time allows, as we're out enjoying the benefits of flying through the skies.
I think the original Sky Spotter program had a phrase something like one cross-country, one PIREP or something like that, where they were trying to encourage people to file. Is that still kind of what you think makes sense?
I think as a goal, yes, the notion of figure that part of your mission in a given flight is to file a pilot report. I just modify that to the extent of, and more if they're warranted, because again, this notion of thinking about, it's not just an act of being able to tick off that I filed a pilot report today, but that I filled a hole in the observation network and I either confirmed a forecast or again reported hazardous conditions. If we kind of have that mindset, then I think we start anticipating when it's appropriate to file reports so that we're doing it in a thoughtful and strategic way.
Well, I'm thinking about pilot reports that are helpful around here. Certainly tops and bases of clouds are pretty handy for people who are getting out of our area here, where we often have a low layer of stratus clouds. But also I think icing. We often will have clouds here, and then the question is there ice in the clouds or is there not ice in the clouds? And I think having these negative reports where people report no icing, no turbulence, that can be just as helpful too.
Yes, and that's something that we heard from numerous of the users, is that negative reports that either confirm the forecast or the lack of hazardous conditions are as important to them as the reports of unforecast conditions. So again, that should be motivation for us to realize that no, we're not wasting people's time if it's a nice day and we're flying around and enjoying good conditions, to at least confirm that periodically as we go.
Well, Tom, as we start to wrap up here, any final thoughts to share on PIREPs and weather?
Yeah, I think the PIREP system is something that's been ignored for a long time. It's getting attention now at multiple levels, and I think the shoe is now kind of on our foot, so to speak, to engage a little bit more and participate in providing pilot reports as well as using them, and to stay tuned for some future developments. I think there are exciting things to come as the FAA really sinks their teeth into this whole topic.
Well, I just had a thought. When people file it in the remarks section, they can put down that they heard it from Tom George on Aviation News Talk.
No, please don't do that.
That's great. Well, Tom, thanks so much for joining us today. This has really been very informative.
My pleasure.
I want to thank Tom for talking with us and also for the huge amount of time he spent with me on phone calls and emails providing background information for this episode. I've also included links in the show notes to many of the things we've talked about. That includes the FAA's advisory circular called Weather Services, the 2016 AOPA PIREP survey, the 2017 Ntsb Special Investigation Report on PIREPs, the 2020 AOPA Weather Survey, information and presentations from the 2020 FAA PIREPs Summit, a link to a NASA ASRS report on PIREPs, and the free PIREP online course offered by AOPA's Air Safety Institute. Now I want to talk briefly about some of the automated tools you can use for submitting PIREPs electronically. My favorite, which I've used for several years, is the PIREP submission function in what was formerly called the AeroV app. That's AeroVie. AeroV was sold in 2019 to Apereo. Apereo has rolled the PIREP submission functionality into their electronic flight bag app they call Stratus Insight. If you have an LTE connection in the air, or if you have an Iridium Go satellite communicator, your PIREP is submitted immediately. If you don't have a cellular connection when you submit a PIREP, your PIREP is held in an offline queue and is then transmitted when you later get an internet connection, either in the air or on the ground. The app's PIREP submission form I find pretty intuitive. It lets you type altitude in directly in number of feet, and you can select the level of turbulence, rain, or icing by just tapping a symbol. And if you don't know all of the symbols, when you tap one, for example, if you tap moderate turbulence, the words moderate turbulence are displayed above the symbol. I used the app while I was at 5,000 feet over the Sacramento VOR to submit a PIREP, and I later found the PIREP displayed on the Sirius XM weather service that we were using in the Cirrus SR20 we were flying. Stratus Insight is more than just an electronic PIREP submission tool, however. It really is a full-featured electronic flight bag, and they have a strong emphasis on pre-flight weather planning. Stratus Insight is available for download from the Apple App Store, and it currently offers 2 subscription plans, $9.99 a month or $999.99 annually. It's only available for iOS devices. Another way to submit PIREPs electronically is the Aviation Weather Center, better known as aviationweather.gov, and it has a feature that lets you submit a PIREP over the internet. And if you can get cellular data while you're in the air, you can submit PIREPs for free over their website. But you'll need to plan ahead in advance, because to submit PIREPs through their site, you first have to create an account, and then you have to contact the AWC to request permission to submit PIREPs. And to get that authorization, besides providing your full name, you'll also have to provide your airman certificate number or an affiliation with either an airline, flight school, government, or military organization. Then to submit a PIREP, you need to go to aviationweather.gov, sign into your account, and look under the Tools pull-down menu at the top and select PIREP Submit. Those words are fairly small, so if you're using a handheld device in an airplane, you'll probably need to pinch to zoom so that you can see what you're tapping on. Then you have a choice of entering a full report, which uses a pilot weather report form that emulates the FAA form, or you can select Dispatcher, which provides a shorter abbreviated form. I used the full form, and I noticed that entering the location was a little more difficult since you had to manually enter the bearing and distance to the nearest airport or VOR, while in the Stratus Insight app, you can just have the app enter your current GPS location. Also, when I went to enter the altitude, initially the form was rejected because I entered 1,500 feet as 1500 instead of in hundreds of feet using 3 digits, so I had to enter 1,500 instead as 015. I also entered the outside air temperature and winds aloft since it was a nice day, but I had also meant to enter negative turbulence as I had on the Stratus Insight app. But in the AWC form, negative turbulence is in a second column and the type is small, and I didn't see it when I was in the air, so I submitted it without the negative turbulence report. Later on the ground, I could easily see where I could have entered that. Now, the difference between those 2 PIREPs I submitted, one submitted with turbulence with Stratus Insight and one entered without turbulence via the AWC, helped find a bug on the Aviation Weather Center website. After submitting both PIREPs, Tom George, who we just talked with, searched for my reports on AWC but only found one of my PIREPs. I then happened to search for my PIREPs on a different page on aviationweather.gov, and I also just found one of my PIREPs, but it was not the one that Tom George could see. And I sent this finding off to the AWC and very quickly got a reply saying that they thought they had a bug in the PIREP page. And in case you're curious, Tom George was looking on their GFA page, or graphical forecast for aviation page, and I was looking instead on the PIREPs page. I've also tested out an app called Virga. In fact, my whole interest in doing this episode on PIREPs was triggered by an email last summer from Matt Lane, who's the developer of Virga. Matt later introduced me to a number of people working on PIREPs, which is how I came to know of Tom George, and I really want to thank Matt for providing me with that wealth of information and contacts on PIREPs. Virga has some great features and excellent usability, though it's still missing one key feature available in the other two methods that I just mentioned, and that is that any PIREPs entered in Virga aren't yet shared with the Aviation Weather Center, and hence don't enter the main distribution system that shares PIREPs with briefers and pilots. That is something they plan to add to Virga in the future, but for the moment, any PIREPs you enter are only shared with other Virga users. And that might be helpful, for example, for a flight school or flying club with a lot of users flying in the same area who want to share their personal PIREPs with each other. It could also be useful for a charter company or a small airline that flies in the same area and wants to share data with other pilots in the company. I really liked how Virga lets you create custom alerts for an area that you draw on a map in the app. For example, I've drawn a big circle around the greater San Francisco Bay Area, and I get alerts for all PIREPs that are generated in that area, and that includes PIREPs that are generated nationally through the AWC system. Virga also lets you follow other users so you can see PIREPs submitted by your friends and colleagues, and you can take a photo and attach it to the PIREP. So Virga has a lot of nice features, and it will be even better when it's able to take the PIREPs you submit and enter them into the National PIREP Distribution Center. You can find Virga in the Apple App Store. It includes a free 30-day trial, and after that, it's only $2 a month. Also, CFIs can get the app free for a year by submitting their certificate number. And of course, I've included links to Apereo's Stratus Insight, the Aviation Weather Center's Submit PIREP page, and to the Virga app in our show notes. Just go to aviationnewstalk.com/182 to find the show notes. And just a reminder, if you would, to help us out, please take just a moment now and use the share button on whatever app that you're using and share this episode with all of your aviation friends, especially anybody you think could benefit from learning about PIREPs. And then afterwards, encourage them to subscribe to the show or follow the show, as it's now called in the Apple Podcast app, because that's one of the best ways we have to grow this show. Thanks so much for doing that. I really appreciate your help with this. So until next time, fly safely, have fun, and keep the blue side up.